This story isn't about money, it isn't about success, and it isn't about becoming rich. It's about a young man who walked away from everything familiar, carrying one old backpack, 500 rupees, and a future he couldn't yet imagine. At the time, it felt like an ordinary day. Looking back, it was the day everything changed. He didn't know if he was making the biggest mistake of his life, or the best decision he would ever make. To everyone else, it was just another morning. To him, it was the beginning of a journey that would change the way he saw the world. Let's go back to where it all began. July 13th. If you ask him today when his life really changed, he won't tell you about his first success. He won't mention a degree, a job, or any achievement. He'll tell you about a morning when his wallet held exactly 500 rupees and everything he owned fit inside one old backpack. It was July 13th. The village hadn't fully woken up yet. A rooster called from somewhere beyond the trees. The smell of damp soil drifted through the open window after the night's rain. In a small room, a young boy sat on the edge of his bed. The backpack was already packed. He unzipped it anyway. One shirt came out, another went in. Then he changed his mind and switched them back. The clothes weren't the problem. He was simply trying to delay the moment he had to leave. He looked around the room. The calendar still hung on the same rusty nail. The crack running across one wall had been there for years. His school certificates were folded neatly inside a plastic file. Everything looked exactly as it had the day before. Only one thing was different. By evening, this room would no longer be his everyday life. Before stepping outside, he checked his wallet. 500 rupees. He already knew how much was inside. He wasn't counting the money anymore. He was counting how many mistakes he could afford to make. He picked up the backpack. It felt lighter than he expected. Funny how a bag can weigh almost nothing, while the decision to carry it changes your entire life. The road out of the village was familiar. Every turn carried a memory. The tea shop where people gathered every morning. The football ground where evenings disappeared without anyone noticing. The road he had walked hundreds of times. Today, it felt different. Not because the road had changed, because he knew he wasn't coming back the same person. Nobody waved dramatically. Nobody gave a speech. Life rarely pauses to acknowledge the moments that later become unforgettable. The village simply continued waking up, while one of its boys quietly disappeared into the distance. By afternoon, he was standing inside an airport for the first time. Everything demanded attention. Glass walls taller than any building he had ever entered. People pulling suitcases that rolled without making much noise. Screens changing every few seconds. Announcements echoing overhead in languages he couldn't always follow. For a moment, he stood still, not because he was lost, because there was too much to understand all at once. He watched people move through security as if they had done it 100 times. He copied whatever the person in front of him did. When they placed their bag on the conveyor belt, he placed his. When they walked through the scanner, he followed. No one had taught him any of this. He learned by observing, quietly, without asking anyone to notice. Then came the airplane. His first. The engines started. People around him kept talking. Some laughed, some scrolled through their phones. A man beside him opened a laptop before the aircraft had even taken off. He couldn't understand how everyone looked so calm. As the plane began moving, he held the armrest a little tighter. He hoped nobody noticed. Then, the ground slowly disappeared. Roads became thin lines. Rivers looked like threads. Houses turned into tiny dots. The village he had known all his life had become too small to find. He didn't expect that feeling. Not sadness, not excitement. Something in between. The realization that the world was much larger than the one he had spent 20 years trying to understand. He looked around the cabin. A little girl
Dad,
argued with
I
her
really
father
want the window.
because she
Okay, you
wanted
can
a
have it.
window
Move
seat.
over.
A businessman ordered coffee without asking the price. Two college students laughed over something on a phone screen. Someone fell asleep before the seatbelt sign even switched off. It wasn't their clothes that surprised him, or their phones, or the expensive watches on a few wrists. It was how normal all of this seemed to them. For them, this was just another flight. For him, every second felt like entering a chapter he had only imagined. Without realizing it, he looked down at his own hands. Hands that had carried buckets, moved furniture, worked through holidays. Hands that had learned responsibility long before comfort. He wondered, how many worlds exist without us ever knowing they do? Maybe the biggest difference between people isn't talent. Maybe it's simply the number of possibilities they've been exposed to. That thought stayed with him long after the flight ended. When the airplane landed, everyone stood up immediately. He stayed seated for another second, not because he was tired, because he wanted to remember this feeling. The doors opened. Warm air rushed inside. He stepped into Bengaluru. The airport alone felt larger than the town where he had grown up. Automatic doors opened before he even touched them. Escalators carried hundreds of people without stopping. Outside, traffic moved in every direction. Glass buildings reflected the afternoon sun. People switched effortlessly between different languages. Nobody looked around. Nobody seemed impressed. This was simply their everyday life. He realized something that afternoon. The city wasn't extraordinary. He was simply seeing a world he had never had the chance to see before. That thought changed everything. He reached into his pocket. The wallet was still there. The 500 rupees was still inside. His backpack was still hanging from one shoulder. Nothing he owned had changed, but something he couldn't touch had. Until that day, he believed the world was roughly the size of the place he came from. Now he knew better. There were bigger cities, bigger opportunities, bigger dreams, and perhaps a bigger version of himself waiting somewhere ahead. Years later, people would see the achievements, the photographs, the milestones, the things that look impressive from a distance. Almost nobody would remember the boy standing quietly in an airport with 500 rupees in his wallet, trying to hide the fact that everything around him felt unfamiliar. But he remembers, because that was the day he stopped asking, "Can someone like me belong in a world like this?" And started asking, "What do I need to learn to build a place for myself here?" Looking back, that small change in the question mattered more than the amount of money in his pocket. The 500 rupees eventually disappeared. The backpack grew old. The city became familiar. But the decision to leave home became the foundation for every chapter that followed. Sometimes, your life doesn't change because you arrive somewhere new. It changes because, for the first time, you realize how much more is possible than you had ever been allowed to imagine. That arriving here was the easiest part of the journey. The story isn't over. It's only just beginning.
If this chapter inspired you,
Leave a like, subscribe, and join us for the next part of the journey.
because the best chapters are still waiting to be written.
We'll see you in the next part.